first four propositions on the November ballot are bond measures. Now, to understand these propositions, it's important to understand what general obligation bonds are and how they work. So I'm going to try, this might be a little bit simplified, but I'm trying to get the general point across. When a state wants to enact a policy, there are a couple ways that it can pay for it. First, the state can pay for it using money from the general fund. The general fund, you're going to hear me using that term throughout these videos. Although it's not a perfect comparison, you can think of the general fund as the state's checkbook, right? When we pay taxes or fees, certain fees, that money goes into the state's general fund. And when the state uses money from the general fund, it basically withdraws it the same way you would do it if you're making like a car payment. And so that money that gets withdrawn and sent to pay the car payment, that money can't be used for anything else. So when you think about the general fund is kind of like the state's checkbook, that checking account, and that's where all the money is deposited. Alternatively, if a state wants to enact a policy that costs money, they can pay for it by selling general obligation bonds. Now here's how that works. Suppose a state wants to enact a policy that costs $1 billion, and they don't want to pay for it out of the general fund. They don't want to deplete what's in their checking account. What they can do instead is sell general obligation bonds to investors who are repaid. Let's say an investor wants to go ahead and buy $100,000 in bonds. What the state agrees to do is repay that $100,000 plus interest. So if an investor bought a $100,000 bond, they'd write a check to the state of California for $100,000, and the state would agree to pay back the $100,000. That's the principal, plus interest, plus money on top of it. The interest is how much the state is going to pay the investor back for loaning the money to the state. So they may pay back the $100,000 for the bond, the principal, plus an additional $100,000, the interest. Altogether, the investor is going to be paid back $200,000 over many years for a $100,000 loan. It's like a long-term investment, and the key is that it's a very safe investment. Here's why. In California, one of the first things paid out of our budget are general obligation bond payments. So even if a state's having financial problems, they're required by law to meet their bond obligations. It's kind of like having money automatically come out of the state's checking account. It basically guarantees investors that they'll get paid, which is why they're a safe investment. Now, although it's not a perfect comparison, it might be helpful to think of this in terms of purchasing things on a credit card. Whenever you use a credit card, you're borrowing money from your bank. And if you're being responsible, when you use your credit card, you're thinking about how much you're actually borrowing, the principal, how much you're charging on your card, and the interest as well, the money you're being charged to borrow the money, right? That's how much the bank is charging you to borrow the money. Now, in some cases, borrowing money is a smart thing to do, even when you factor in the interest. For example, if your car breaks down and the repairs are going to cost $500, it may make sense to borrow that money, put it on your card, because otherwise you won't be able to get to work and you'll lose your job and your financial situation will be even worse off. So getting the car fixed may be a really good investment, even if when you add the principal and interest, the cost of the repairs is actually $700. The $500 the bank gave you to give to the mechanic, and the $200 they charge you to borrow the money. It may still be a good investment. A lot of times when people buy homes, it's a good investment because oftentimes the value of homes go up. So if you buy a $200,000 home and you're in it for many years, it might be worth $500,000 later on. So there are good investments and good reasons to borrow money. But in some cases, borrowing money might be a bad investment. Say, for example, you don't have any savings, you're barely making enough to pay the bills, but you had a really crappy week. So you decide to go to a nice restaurant. You're going to go to a fancy restaurant. You're just going to treat yourself. You're going to invest in your own happiness. The meal costs you $100, but since you don't have any money, you put it on the credit card. And when your credit card bill comes, you pay the minimum amount because you don't have any money saved. If the interest rate on your credit card is very high, by the time you pay off the $100 that you used to pay for the meal, right, you may be charged $150 in interest. That's how much the bank charged you to borrow that money. So that $100 dinner actually costs you $250. Now maybe in that case, borrowing money isn't such a good idea. In other words, if you knew it was actually going to cost you $250, you might have decided not to go to that restaurant or to go somewhere less expensive, or maybe even go home and make a sandwich and save your money. My point is to caution you against thinking that all investments are good or that all investments are bad. Each investment should be evaluated in terms of what you're getting from borrowing the money and what it's actually going to cost you when you go ahead and pay it off, the principal and the interest. And that's what general obligation bonds are. That's when the state is borrowing money and where investors are going ahead and buying these bonds, and the state is agreeing to pay the investors back both the principal and the interest on the bonds. Okay, so hopefully that helps. I know that was a lot of information in a relatively short amount of time, but I hope that clarifies matters. And next what we'll do is we'll move on to Proposition 1.